Lichens are partnerships. They're a partnership between a fungus and an alga, and the alga carries out photosynthesis. So part of their purpose is producing food that they consume as well as other organisms consume. So there's a lot of small animals that eat lichens, that live on lichens. So lichens can play a number of different roles in ecosystems, but those are really the most central ones. They're not plants, but they're like plants in that they carry out photosynthesis. One of the reasons people don't notice lichens very much is because they're small and they're hard to see, and magnifying glasses really help in that. And so if I want to look at this particular lichen, what I want to do is get the magnifying glass very close and then move my eye right there. And when I do that, I can see that every little piece of this lichen has a tiny little reproductive structure in it, making lots of spores to allow reproduction of the lichen. Lichens have two sort of primary ways of reproduction. One is sexual reproduction, where they produce spores, and those spores fly through the air, and if they land somewhere good, somewhere that they can grow, they can grow into a lichen. But a lot of lichens also reproduce asexually. So they produce small structures that have all the lichen components. They can be dispersed by wind, by water, by squirrels walking over them. And if they end up in a spot that's a good place for the lichen to grow, they can grow directly into a lichen. These lichens behind us here, these ones, are reproducing sexually. They're not reproducing asexually. So some lichens reproduce one way, some the other, some do both at the same time. So it's a lot more complicated than human reproduction. One of the most common places you might find lichens are things you walk on. They're going to spend most of their time dormant, but when it rains, they're going to become biologically active, they're going to carry out photosynthesis, they're going to produce a little bit of food. Eventually they'll reproduce and produce some spores, and some of those spores will land on concrete somewhere else and start to grow. Why are there so many lichens? Well, it's like everything else in biology. Evolution is always going on, and there's so many different kinds of habitats that as that process goes on, there's going to be the production of many different kinds. We can see here on this bark, without even using a magnifying glass, there's at least 3 different types of lichens that are just right here. So there are lots of them. Maybe it kind of helps to put this in context. A lot of people know about birds and how many different kinds of birds there are in Iowa. Turns out there's as many different kinds of lichens in Iowa as there are birds in Iowa, and way more lichens in Iowa than there are mammals in Iowa. there's a lot of explanations for why different kinds of organisms look different. Let's think about some familiar examples first. Why do cows look different than pigs? Why does corn look different than soybeans? And the answer fundamentally is the information that's encoded in their DNA. That's why people look different than other kinds of organisms. And in fact, it's also why individual people within our species don't all look the same. So the same basic thing applies to lichens. Each group of lichens has its own evolutionary history, its own DNA sequence, and that information encoded in the DNA results in here's what the appearance of that lichen is going to be. Everything from color to shape to any other features that you want to point at. The other thing I should say, though, and this is true of people too, it's not just DNA. It's also the environment that you're exposed to. So even members of the same lichen species won't all look exactly identical because it's going to depend. Were they growing in a really sunny spot? Were they maybe growing in a shady spot? Was it a really great place for them? Was it kind of a marginal place for them? So there's environmental impacts on how those individual lichens appear as well. One of the things that fascinates me the most about lichens, they are just tough. They live in these kind of habitats, concrete, steel, tree bark. They live there all year long. You don't have to make special efforts to find them other than just walk outside of your building. So that's part of what really interests me about lichens is they're survivors. They're able to handle a wide range of conditions and come back and still keep going.